Before we begin, a quick and important disclaimer. The following content is provided for educational and entertainment purposes only and does not constitute legal, financial, or professional advice. The history of American television and its intersection with family law is a complex sociological subject involving historical trends and evolving legal frameworks. Viewers should conduct their own due diligence and consult with qualified legal professionals regarding any personal matters related to divorce, family law, or domestic litigation. This video presents a deep dive into historical media representation and its correlation with societal changes, and potential outcomes discussed are based on historical case studies rather than a prescriptive guide for the future. In 1950, if you walked into any American living room, the television was a flickering altar to the unbreakable nuclear family. Shows like Father Knows Best and The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet were not just entertainment. They were instructional manuals for the American male on how to lead a household. But fast forward just 30 years, and the image of the stoic, undisputed patriarch had been replaced by the bumbling dad, the struggling single father, and the frequent visitor in a custody battle. There is a staggering statistic that often goes overlooked in our modern discourse. Since the introduction of no-fault divorce in 1969, the divorce rate in the United States effectively doubled, peaking in the early 1980s. But here is the question that should keep you up tonight. Did the law change because our culture changed, or did our culture change because of what we saw on that glowing screen? Today, we are opening a loop that connects the history of the sitcom to the very real, very high-stakes reality of the modern family court system. We are going to explore how television transitioned from a tool of marital stability to a catalyst for domestic dissolution, and why the bumbling dad trope might be the most expensive stereotype ever marketed to the American man. By the end of this deep dive masterclass, you will understand the invisible architecture of the American family unit, as defined by mass media. For the men watching this today, this solves a fundamental problem of perspective. We often feel like the challenges we face in the modern dating and marital landscape are personal or isolated, but when you look at the historical data and the media trends, you realize you are operating within a system that was redesigned in real time between 1950 and 1990. We are going to break down the shift from fault-based marriage to contract-based dissolution, and how the portrayal of men on screen shifted from the provider to the punchline, creating a psychological environment that made the skyrocketing divorce rates of the late 20th century almost inevitable. To understand where we are, we have to go back to the 1950s, the era often referred to as the golden age of television. During this period, the Federal Communications Commission and the major networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, operated under a strict, self-imposed moral code known as the Television Code. This code was an extension of the earlier Hays Code from the film industry, and its primary goal was to ensure that television remained wholesome. Under these guidelines, divorce was a taboo subject. If a character was single, they were almost always a widow or a widower. Consider the show The Andy Griffith Show or My Three Sons. These were shows featuring single fathers, but the mothers didn't leave, they passed away. This was a deliberate choice by writers to avoid the scandal of a broken home, while still exploring the dynamics of a father-led household. In this era, the legal reality for men was one of fault-based divorce. To end a marriage, one party had to prove that the other had committed a specific legal wrong, such as adultery, extreme cruelty, or abandonment. Television reinforced this legal status quo by presenting marriage as a permanent, sacred, and functional institution where the man's role was clearly defined as the head of household. In shows like Leave It to Beaver, Ward Cleaver was the moral arbiter. He wasn't just a provider. He was the judge, the mentor, and the rock. This media representation provided a sense of security and a blueprint for the millions of veterans returning from World War II, who were looking to build stable lives in the newly forming suburbs. The suburban dream was as much a product of television marketing as it was of post-war economic policy. However, beneath this veneer of stability, the seeds of a massive shift were being planted. As we moved into the 1960s, the new frontier of the Kennedy era brought a subtle shift in how domestic life was portrayed. We began to see the disenchanted suburbia. While shows still largely avoided divorce, they began to hint at the isolation felt by both men and women within the rigid structures of the 1950s model. The Dick Van Dyke Show, for example, showed a more playful equal partnership, but it also highlighted the stresses of the modern workforce on the male psyche. The man was no longer just a stoic statue. He was becoming human, and with that humanity came vulnerability. The true pivot point, the moment the world changed for the American man both legally and culturally, occurred in 1969. This was the year that then Governor of California Ronald Reagan signed the Family Law Act of 1969, which established the nation's first no-fault divorce law. This meant that a marriage could be dissolved simply due to irreconcilable differences. No one had to be the villain. No one had to prove adultery. While this was seen as a progressive move to reduce the bitterness and perjury often found in fault-based trials, its impact on the social fabric was immediate and profound. Television, ever the mirror of society, wasted no time in reflecting this new reality, but it did so in a way that fundamentally altered the perception of the father figure. Enter the 1970s and the rise of the socially conscious sitcom. Producers like Norman Lear and Grant Tinker began to push the boundaries of what could be discussed on air. All in the Family gave us Archie Bunker, a man whose authority was constantly being challenged by his meathead son-in-law and his changing neighborhood. The patriarchal certainty of Ward Cleaver was gone, replaced by a man who was often the butt of the joke, struggling to make sense of a world that was moving past him. Simultaneously, shows like Maude began to tackle divorce head-on. In 1972, Maude Finley became a symbol of the liberated woman, and for the first time divorce wasn't a tragedy to be whispered about. It was a path to self-actualization. For the American man watching these shows, the message was shifting. The provider role was being critiqued as stifling, and the legal system was following suit. Historical trends show that as television began to normalize the idea of the blended family, or the single mother, the social stigma surrounding divorce evaporated. The Brady Bunch, which debuted in 1969, presented a sanitized version of the blended family, where the challenges of merging two households were solved in 30 minutes with a catchy theme song. While the show was lighthearted, it performed a massive piece of cultural work. It made the broken home seem not just acceptable, but perhaps even more fun than the traditional one. But as the 1970s progressed, the realist movement in TV took a darker turn for the portrayal of men. We began to see the emergence of the deadbeat or absent father archetype in dramas, while comedies leaned heavily into the bumbling dad. In One Day at a Time, which premiered in 1975, the focus was entirely on a divorced mother raising two daughters. The father was a secondary character, often portrayed as unreliable or emotionally distant. This period marks a critical shift in the potential outcomes for men in the cultural imagination. If the 1950s told men they were the kings of their castles, the 1970s told them they were optional. This brings us to a crucial step-by-step breakdown of how media consumption during this era influenced the legal expectations of the next generation. Step 1 was the normalization of divorce as a routine life event. Step 2 was the marginalization of the father's role in the domestic sphere on screen. Step 3 was the legal system's adaptation to these new cultural norms, shifting toward primary caretaker standards that, historically, often disadvantaged men who had been encouraged by the very same media to focus solely on their roles as providers. Consider the case study of the show The Mary Tyler Moore Show. Originally, the writers wanted Mary Richards to be a divorcee. The network, however, was terrified of alienating audiences and insisted she just be a woman who had ended a long-term engagement. By the time the show ended in 1977, the idea of a divorced woman as a lead was not just acceptable, it was the standard. This shift in the female lead's narrative necessitated a shift in the male counterpart's narrative. If the woman was the hero of her own story of independence, the man she left behind was, by default, the obstacle she had to overcome. This narrative structure began to seep into the collective consciousness, influencing jury pools, legislators, and the men themselves. As we move toward the 1980s, the deep dive into this history reveals an even more complex layer. The 80s introduced the sensitive man trope, a reaction to the perceived harshness of the previous decades. However, this often manifested as men who were emotionally literate but legally and domestically powerless. The transition from the 1950s to the 1980s represents one of the most rapid and total transformations of a social role in human history, and television was the primary engine of that change. We aren't just talking about entertainment. We are talking about the rewriting of the social contract. In the next parts of this series, we will examine how the 1980s and 90s took these seeds and grew them into the modern divorce industrial complex we see today. But the foundation was laid here, in the glow of the mid-century cathode ray tube. As we step out of the 1970s and into the neon-soaked reality of the 1980s, the American landscape for men and marriage underwent a transformation so radical, it is still being felt in the family courts of 2026. Imagine if you were a young father in 1981. This was the year the United States hit its all-time peak divorce rate, with roughly 5.3 divorces for every 1,000 people. You weren't just living through a demographic shift, you were living through a cultural earthquake. If you turned on your television, the reflection staring back at you was no longer the confident, all-knowing patriarch of the previous generation. Instead, you were met with a new double-edged archetype: the sensitive, struggling father and the comically inept husband. This era began with the heavy shadow of the 1979 film Kramer vs. Kramer, which, while a movie, dictated the entire narrative structure of 1980s television dramas. It was a case study in the new American domestic reality. For the first time, a mainstream audience saw a father, played by Dustin Hoffman, forced to learn how to make French toast while navigating a high-stakes custody battle. This film did something revolutionary. It humanized the father's desire for custody, but it also cemented the idea that for a man to be a good father, he had to prove he could perform the traditional roles of the mother. Television writers took this and ran with it, creating a decade of programming that obsessed over the idea of the displaced man. In the mid-1980s, we saw the rise of the domestic doofus, a trope that would eventually become the multi-billion-dollar marketing standard we see today. Consider the historical trends of the sitcom during this period. On one side, you had The Cosby Show, which attempted to restore the image of the professional, competent father figure. Cliff Huxtable was a doctor, present and wise. This was the ideal, but it was increasingly at odds with the reality being presented in other media. On the other side, you had the massive cultural phenomenon of Married with Children, which debuted in 1987. Al Bundy became the anti-hero for a generation of men who felt trapped by the economic and social pressures of the post-no-fault divorce era. Al was a man whose high school glory days were behind him, who worked a dead-end job, and whose family openly mocked his existence. This wasn't just comedy. It was a cynical autopsy of the American nuclear family. The show portrayed marriage as a prison and children as the jailers. For men navigating the rising costs of living and the increasing frequency of domestic litigation, Al Bundy wasn't a caricature. He was a warning. While the 80s were playing with these archetypes, the legal system was undergoing a quiet but massive overhaul that would change the stakes of divorce for men forever. In 1984, the United States Congress passed the Child Support Enforcement Act, followed by the Family Support Act of 1988. These laws mandated that states establish numerical guidelines for child support awards. Historically, child support had been a discretionary matter for judges, but now it was becoming an automated, formulaic process. Television began to reflect this by introducing the deadbeat dad as a common antagonist in procedural dramas and daytime talk shows. Shows like Donahue and later Sally Jesse Raphael often featured segments where men were grilled on air about their financial obligations. This created a powerful potential outcome narrative in the public psyche. If a man left a marriage, he was either a bumbling idiot who couldn't fry an egg, or he was a villain fleeing his financial responsibilities. The middle ground, the man who was a competent, loving parent but simply no longer compatible with his spouse, was almost entirely absent from the screen. Imagine if a judge in 1989, who had spent their evening watching a sitcom where the father forgot his own kid's birthday, was then asked to decide on a custody arrangement the next morning. The cultural default was shifting toward the mother as the primary emotional and practical anchor of the home. We see this play out in the bumbling dad evolution of the late 80s and early 90s. Think about Homer Simpson, who debuted in his own series in 1989. Homer is the ultimate evolution of the trope. Well-meaning but fundamentally incompetent, dangerous, and entirely dependent on his wife, Marge, to keep the family from collapsing. When you spend 30 years watching the father figure be portrayed as the third child in the marriage, it inevitably impacts how best interests of the child standards are applied in real-world 2026 courtrooms. These standards are subjective, and subjectivity is fueled by cultural narratives. If the historical trend shown on TV is that fathers are secondary caretakers, then the potential outcome in a courtroom often follows that same path. By the time we hit the 1990s, the divorce industrial complex was in full swing. This term refers to the multi-billion-dollar ecosystem of lawyers, mediators, evaluators, and state agencies that manage the dissolution of families. Television in the 90s began to treat divorce not as a tragedy, but as a lifestyle transition. Shows like Seinfeld or Friends featured characters who were either divorced or products of divorce, and it was treated with a shrug. The high-stakes emotional weight of the 1970s divorce special episodes was replaced by a casual acceptance. However, for men, this casual transition often came with a heavy price tag. The 90s saw the emergence of the weekend dad trope, In movies like Mrs. Doubtfire, 1993, which had massive television syndication, we see a father so desperate to see his children that he has to cross-dress and lie to the court system. While played for laughs, the underlying reality was a case study in the custody gap. The father was the fun, irresponsible one. The mother was the grown-up who had to keep the rules. This dynamic reinforced the idea that men were visitors in their children's lives, rather than equal partners in parenting. Step by step, the media was dismantling the legal and social standing of the father. Step 1. Make him the joke, the 80s sitcom. Step 2. Make him the financial engine but remove his domestic authority, the 84-88 legislation and its TV coverage. Step 3. Make his absence or marginalization normal, the 90s ensemble show. As we look at these historical trends, we have to ask, how much of our modern understanding of male roles in divorce is based on biological reality, and how much is based on a script written in a Hollywood writer's room 40 years ago? The 1990s gave us Home Improvement, where Tim Taylor's manliness was a constant source of ridicule and needed to be managed by his wife. This reinforced the man-child narrative that has become a staple of modern domestic litigation. If a man is portrayed as a child, he cannot be a co-parent. He can only be supervised. We are seeing the results of this today in 2026, where the fight for 50-50 default custody is still a major legislative battle in many states. The potential outcomes for men in the 90s were shaped by a media that viewed them as optional. But what happens when the bumbling dad gets tired of the joke? What happens when the weekend dad decides he wants the whole week? The 1990s didn't just normalize divorce, it commercialized it. The divorce industrial complex found its voice in the sensationalism of the 90s, leading into an era where the legal battles of the rich and famous became our nightly entertainment. But as we transition into the 2000s, the narrative takes an even darker turn. The goofy dad is about to meet the reality TV era, where the broken home isn't just a sitcom premise, it's a competition. How did the rise of judge shows and reality family dramas turn the private pain of men into a public spectator sport? And more importantly, how did the introduction of domestic violence narratives in the late 90s television change the silver bullet strategy in divorce proceedings? We are about to dive into the era of The Sopranos and the Dark Patriarch, where the stakes move from French toast to total legal warfare. You need to see how the 2000s weaponized everything we've discussed so far. The transition into the year 2000 marked a violent departure from the goofy, harmless antics of the 1990s sitcom dad. If the previous decade was about the father as a bumbling but lovable accessory, the 2000s introduced the era of the anti-hero, led by the cultural juggernaut that was The Sopranos. Imagine if you were a man in 2004, sitting in your recliner, watching Tony Soprano navigate the impossible tension between his biological family and his criminal family. For the first time in decades, television was depicting a patriarch who was not a joke, but he was also deeply broken. Tony Soprano represented a case study in The Dark Patriarch, a man who provided everything materially, but was emotionally isolated from a wife who held the moral high ground and children who viewed him with a mix of fear and contempt. This show didn't just entertain. It signaled a historical trend where the male role in the household was being recast as a source of psychological trauma. This shift in scripted television was happening simultaneously with the explosion of reality TV, which would eventually weaponize the divorce process for public consumption. By 2002, the airwaves were saturated with shows like Divorce Court, Judge Judy, and Judge Joe Brown. These programs were not merely legal proceedings, they were morality plays. For many men, these shows established a dangerous precedent. They popularized the trial by soundbite, where complex, multi-year domestic relationships were reduced to a 12-minute segment of public shaming. The potential outcomes for men in these televised courtrooms were almost always the same. They were portrayed as the financial aggressors, the emotional avoidance, or the primary cause of the family's instability. This era of television taught the American public that the courtroom was a coliseum, and for a man, the best-case scenario was often just a dignified surrender. Consider the case study of the show Dr. Phil, which launched in 2002. While it wasn't a court show, it functioned as a psychological tribunal. For a decade, the American male was frequently brought onto the stage to be diagnosed with toxic traits in front of a live audience. This contributed to a massive cultural shift in the definition of the best interests of the child. Historically, we moved from a presumption of maternal custody to a theoretically gender-neutral standard, but the media of the 2000s began to frame the father as an inherent risk factor. Television dramas like Law & Order, Special Victims Unit, which exploded in popularity during this period, often blurred the lines between domestic disputes and criminal behavior. This created a step-by-step psychological pipeline in the public mind. Step 1: the marriage fails. Step 2: the man is identified as the source of conflict. Step 3: the legal system is used as a tool of containment rather than resolution. Imagine if you were Ethan, a fictional but representative father in 2005. Ethan grew up watching the stable, authoritative fathers of the 50s and 60s, but he was now raising children in a world where TV told him he was either a Tony Soprano or a Homer Simpson. When Ethan's marriage hit the breaking point, he wasn't just walking into a lawyer's office. He was walking into a cultural crossfire. The 2000s saw the rise of the silver bullet strategy in divorce proceedings, the strategic use of domestic violence or abuse allegations to gain leverage in custody battles. While these are serious matters that require the utmost legal protection for genuine victims, historical trends and legal analyses from the mid-2000s noted a sharp increase in the strategic application of these claims. Scripted television played a massive role here. Procedural dramas frequently depicted the abusive father as a standard plot device, making it a common-sense narrative that judges and evaluators had been conditioned to expect. During this period, the failure to provide narrative also shifted. In the 1980s, Al Bundy's struggle was a joke about economic stagnation. In the 2000s, especially leading up to the 2008 financial crisis, the failure to maintain a high-consumption lifestyle was treated in media as a moral failing. The show The OC or The Real Housewives franchise, which began in 2006, showcased the luxury divorce. These shows glamorized the dissolution of marriage among the wealthy, turning the division of assets into a high-stakes competition. For the average man watching, the message was clear. Your value in the family unit is tied directly to your ability to finance a lifestyle that you no longer have any say in. By 2008, as the housing market collapsed, the reality of the American man took another hit. Television began to focus on the man's session, but it did so through a lens of pity or mockery. Shows like Hung or Breaking Bad explored the lengths to which a man would go to provide when the system failed him. Breaking Bad is a particularly powerful case study. Walter White begins his journey as a man trying to secure his family's financial future after a terminal diagnosis, but as the show progresses, he becomes a monster. The series expertly deconstructs the provider role, suggesting that the very impulse to protect and provide can lead to a man's total moral and legal destruction. It was the ultimate open loop for the late 2000s. Is the traditional male role even possible in a world that only values you for what you can give, and then punishes you for how you get it? Step by step, the media was refining the divorce industrial complex. Step 1. The 2000s used reality TV to turn private pain into public entertainment, lowering the social barrier to high-conflict litigation. Step 2. Scripted dramas replaced the bumbling dad with the toxic patriarch, creating a new cultural baseline for judicial skepticism. Step 3. The 2008 economic crash, as portrayed on screen, severed the link between a man's hard work and his family's stability, leaving him vulnerable to the contract-based dissolution we discussed earlier. For the men of 2026 looking back, this era was the turning point where the social safety net of the family was replaced by the social surveillance of the state and the media. We weren't just watching Tony Soprano or Walter White, we were watching the slow-motion dismantling of the father's place at the head of the table. The potential outcomes for men were becoming increasingly binary. You were either the provider who lost it all, or the toxic influence who was removed for the best interests of the group. But as the 2000s closed and we entered the 2010s, a new technology was about to change the game again. Social media and the smartphone revolution took the scripts written in Hollywood and put them into the pockets of every spouse and child in America. How did the rise of Facebook and Instagram turn your private life into evidence for your own divorce? And how did the streaming era finally kill the traditional family sitcom for good, replacing it with something far more fragmented and dangerous for the modern father? In the next part, we are going to look at the digital divorce and how the 2010s turned your own data into a weapon in the family court system. You aren't just being judged by a jury of your peers anymore. You're being judged by an algorithm that was trained on the tropes we've just explored. We are moving into the era of the managed man, and the stakes have never been higher. The dawn of the 2010s did not just bring us better resolution on our television screens, it brought a total resolution of the private sphere. As the smartphone became an extension of the human hand, the barrier between a man's internal life and his legal liability vanished. Imagine if you are Liam, a father of 2 in 2014. You are navigating the early days of a separation. You post a photo on Facebook of yourself at a baseball game with a beer in your hand. A simple moment of decompression. In the 1970s, that moment would have existed only in memory. In 2014, and certainly by 2026, that image becomes Exhibit A in a custody hearing to suggest an lifestyle incompatible with primary caretaking. This is the era where the historical trends of television merged with the data-driven reality of the digital dossier. Television during this decade shifted from the broad, multicam sitcom to the more nuanced, single-camera mockumentary style, most notably seen in Modern Family. This show is a fascinating case study in the evolution of the American patriarch. Phil Dunphy represents the absolute peak of the managed man. Phil is kind, he is enthusiastic, and he is a loving father, but he is fundamentally a child who must be directed, corrected, and managed by his wife, Claire. If Ward Cleaver was the captain of the ship, Phil Dunphy is the talented but scatterbrained deckhand. The historical trend here is vital. Television began to tell men that their value was found in their niceness and their approachability, rather than their authority or leadership. While this made for heartwarming television, it created a massive psychological disadvantage in the legal arena. When a man is culturally conditioned to be managed, he often carries that submissive posture into the mediation room, leading to potential outcomes where he concedes more than the law actually requires. In 2010, a survey by the American Academy of Matrimonial Lawyers revealed a staggering statistic. 81% of the nation's top divorce attorneys said they had seen an increase in the number of cases using social media evidence. This was the decade of the selfie divorce. Television shows like The Good Wife or Suits began to incorporate these digital footprints into their plot lines, showing viewers exactly how a private message or a liked photo could be subpoenaed. This wasn't just drama. It was a pedagogical tool for the divorce industrial complex. It taught the public that everything is discoverable. For the American man, who historically tended to be less filtered in digital spaces compared to the curated aesthetic of female social media, this created a minefield. Let's look at a step-by-step breakdown of how the 2010s television narrative weaponized the standard of living argument. Step 1. The rise of aspirational TV like Big Little Lies or The Affair. These shows focused on the upper-middle-class aesthetic, where the home, the car, and the vacation were characters in themselves. Step 2. The normalization of lifestyle maintenance as a primary legal goal. Step 3. The emergence of the lifestyle audit in real-world divorce. If the father on screen was expected to provide a coastal mansion even after the marriage dissolved, the real-world expectation followed. The Affair is perhaps the most significant case study of the mid-2010s. The show utilized a split-perspective narrative, showing the same events from the male and female points of view. This was a masterclass in the subjective truth that now dominates family court. It reinforced the idea that there is no objective reality in a marriage, only his version and her version. In a legal system that was moving away from fault, but still relied on narrative, the person who could tell the more compelling story of victimhood or sacrifice usually gained the upper hand. For men, whose television archetypes were increasingly either the bumbling Phil Dunphy or the toxic anti-hero, their narrative options were severely limited. Imagine if you were a judge in 2018. You've spent your weekend binge-watching shows where men are portrayed as either emotionally unavailable or domestically incompetent. On Monday morning, you are asked to decide if a father should have 50-50 custody, or if he should be relegated to the every other weekend role. The historical trends of the 2010s media were not on the father's side. The bumbling dad had evolved into the passive dad. Even in shows that were praised for their progressive portrayals of fatherhood, such as Parenthood, the men were often depicted as being in a constant state of learning how to be parents, whereas the mothers were depicted as having an innate, unquestionable expertise. This cultural backdrop fueled the growth of the managed man archetype. In 2026, we see the long-term potential outcomes of this. We see a generation of men who entered the divorce process believing they were secondary parents because that is what every screen they looked at told them they were. This period also saw the death of the family hour. In the 50s through the 90s, the family sat together to watch the same show. In the 2010s, with the rise of Netflix and personal devices, everyone moved to their own corners. The family unit was literally fragmented by the technology used to consume media. This mirror image fragmentation made the physical fragmentation of the home through divorce feel more natural, and less like a disruption of the social order. During this time, we also saw the rise of the gray divorce. Historical data shows that divorce rates for couples over the age of 50 doubled between 1990 and 2010. Television responded with shows like Grace and Frankie, which centered on two women whose husbands leave them for each other. While comedic, the show highlighted a terrifying reality for men: the clean slate narrative. The idea that a man could, or should, be discarded after decades of providing so that both parties could find their true selves. This shifted the moral weight of divorce. It was no longer about breaking a promise, it was about self-discovery. But for the men in these case studies, the self-discovery often came with the total liquidation of a lifetime of retirement savings and assets. Step by step, the 2010s digital era accomplished what the 70s and 80s started. Step 1. It made every private action public evidence. Step 2. It redefined the father as a managed apprentice in his own home. Step 3. It popularized the idea that marriage is a temporary contract subject to software updates of self-actualization. As we move toward the current year of 2026, we have to address the black swan event that accelerated all of these trends: the 2020 pandemic. When the world shut down and the home became the office, the school, and the gym, the managed man was forced into a 24/7 scrutiny that the television of the 2010s had perfectly prepared us for. But what happens when the remote divorce becomes the norm? What happens when a man's entire relationship with his children is mediated through a Zoom screen? In the next part, we are going to dive into the pandemic pivot and the Zoom court era. We will explore how the most isolated years in modern history became the most profitable years for the divorce industrial complex, and why the work-from-home father became the new target for domestic litigation. The 2020s didn't just change how we work, they changed how we break up. And for the men who thought they were safe because they were present, the reality was much more complicated. Get ready for the era of the surveilled spouse. The era of the surveilled spouse began not with a high-tech spy gadget, but with the humble kitchen table. When the 2020 pandemic forced the American workforce into their living rooms, it effectively turned every home into a 24-hour filming location for a domestic drama that no one signed up for. Imagine if you are David, an executive at a software firm in 2021. For 15 years, your work life and your home life were separated by a 40-minute commute. That commute was your transition zone, a psychological buffer where you shed the high-stress persona of the boardroom before walking through the front door. Suddenly, that buffer vanished. David is now conducting high-stakes negotiations via Zoom, while his children are learning fractions 3 feet away, and his spouse is observing his professional stress in real time. In this pressure cooker, the historical trends of television took a sharp, observational turn. We saw the rise of the quarantine comedy and the remote film special, but more importantly, we saw a shift in how commercials and social media content portrayed the father figure. The bumbling dad was no longer just forgetting to buy milk. He was now portrayed as an intruder in the domestic space that the mother had spent years perfecting. Advertisements during this period frequently showcased the husband as a nuisance who didn't know how to operate the laundry machine, or who interrupted the smooth flow of the household. This reinforced a powerful and legally dangerous narrative: the idea that the father, even when physically present 24 hours a day, is an auxiliary component of the family unit. The legal consequences of this shift became apparent as we moved into 2022 and 2023, and they are fully realized in our current year of 2026. The pandemic created what sociologists call the visibility trap for men. Because David was home all day, every moment of frustration, every late-night work call, and every instance of professional intensity was witnessed and increasingly recorded. We have seen a massive spike in the use of smart home data in divorce proceedings. Historically, a man's absence was his greatest liability in a custody battle. In the post-pandemic era, his presence became the weapon. Consider a case study from 2024 where a father's Ring doorbell camera footage and Nest thermostat logs were used to create a minute-by-minute account of his movements, arguing that his focus on work constituted a constructive abandonment of his parental duties, even though he was under the same roof. This brings us to the rise of the Zoom court, a fundamental change in the architecture of American justice. Before 2020, a man stood in a courtroom. He wore a suit, he looked the judge in the eye, and he existed as a three-dimensional human being. In the era of virtual hearings, that same man is reduced to a 2x2-inch square on a monitor. Historical trends in psychology suggest that it is significantly easier to dehumanize and rule against someone when they are experienced through a screen. For men, who already struggled against the bumbling or toxic archetypes we've explored, The loss of physical presence in the courtroom was a devastating blow. The judge is no longer seeing David the father, they are seeing David the digital asset. Step by step, the pandemic era redefined the primary caretaker standard. Step 1. The lockdowns forced both parents into the home, theoretically leveling the playing field for parenting time. Step 2, however, because the cultural narrative, fueled by television and social media, continued to frame the mother as the default manager of the household, any domestic labor the father performed was viewed as helping rather than parenting. Step 3. When the divorce filings surged in 2021 and 2022, courts were flooded with present but absent arguments. Attorneys argued that while the father was home, his mental load was elsewhere, thereby maintaining the maternal preference in custody arrangements. Imagine the scenario for a man in 2026. The world has returned to a new normal, but the digital trail left behind during the lockdown years is permanent. Your own home has become a witness against you. The rise of the Internet of Things means your refrigerator knows when you're stressed, your smartwatch knows your heart rate during an argument, and your browser history knows your darkest fears about your failing marriage. Television shows like Black Mirror have touched on these themes, but for the modern man in the middle of a dissolution, it's not science fiction. It's the discovery process. We must also look at the TikTokification of divorce. In the early 2020s, a new genre of content exploded: the divorce influencer. These are creators who document their separations in real time, often using trending audio and comedic filters to mock their former partners. This has created a crowdsourced verdict culture. Before a man even sets foot in a mediation room, his reputation can be dismantled in 15-second increments for an audience of millions. This is the ultimate evolution of the reality TV era, we discussed in Part 3. The public shaming is no longer reserved for the rich and famous. It is now a standard tool for the average person. This constant surveillance has led to the emergence of the hyper-managed man. This is the father who is so aware of the potential for his actions to be recorded and used against him that he becomes a ghost in his own home. He stops speaking, he stops asserting his needs, and he retreats into a state of total compliance, hoping that his good behavior will protect him in the eventual legal fallout. But as the case studies of 2026 show, this passivity is often interpreted by the courts as a lack of interest or a lack of leadership, which only reinforces the bumbling or secondary parent tropes. As we look deeper into the history of American television, we see that the medium has always been about one thing: the control of the narrative. From the scripted perfection of the 50s to the surveilled chaos of the 2020s, the story being told about men has moved further away from the reality of the father as an essential, authoritative, and equal partner. The pandemic didn't just give us Zoom. It gave us a new way to monitor, evaluate, and eventually discard the male role in the family unit under the guise of modernity and safety. But there is a new shadow looming over the horizon of 2026. We are moving out of the era of simple surveillance and into the era of total simulation. What happens when the evidence used against a man in court isn't just a recorded video, but a deepfake? What happens when the bumbling dad trope is weaponized by artificial intelligence to create a narrative that is impossible to disprove? The line between television history and synthetic reality is blurring, and for the man navigating a divorce today, the biggest threat might not be what he did, but what a computer says he did. In the next part, we are going to explore the AI apocalypse of family law. We will look at how the latest advancements in 2026 technology are being used to manufacture historical evidence, and how the tropes of the past are being fed into algorithms to predict and dictate the potential outcomes of your life. We are entering the era of the algorithmic father, and you won't believe how much power you've already given away to the machine. The script for your future has already been written. Now we need to see who is holding the pen. The era of the algorithmic father is not a distant science fiction concept. It is the technical reality of 2026. To understand how we got here, we have to look at the transition from broadcast television to algorithmic streaming. In the 1950s, everyone watched the same 3 channels. In the 1990s, we had cable. But by the 2010s, the algorithm took over, curating a personalized reality for every viewer. This technological shift mirrors exactly what has happened in the American family court system. We have moved from a universal social standard of what a father is to a data-driven, predictive model of what a father is likely to do. Imagine if you are Mark, a 42-year-old father in 2026. Mark is going through a contested divorce. His attorney informs him that the jurisdiction is now using predictive analytics software to assist judges in determining custody schedules. This software is marketed as a tool for neutrality, designed to remove human bias. However, here is the historical trend that should alarm every man. These algorithms are trained on datasets. What is in those datasets? Decades of legal precedents, social worker reports, and psychological evaluations that were all written during the eras we just discussed, the eras of the bumbling dad, the absent provider, and the toxic patriarch. The algorithm isn't a blank slate. It is a digital distillation of every negative stereotype we have seen on television since 1970. Mark's life is now being parsed by a machine that views his 60-hour work week not as a sign of dedication, but as a data point indicating a high probability of parental absence. The machine looks at his digital footprint, his late-night emails, his GPS data from his car, and his streaming history. If Mark's Netflix profile shows a preference for the dark, gritty anti-hero dramas of the 2000s like The Sopranos or Breaking Bad, believe it or not, in 2026, that data can be leveraged in a psychological profile. The case study of Mark reveals a terrifying new front in domestic litigation: the quantified father. When your entire existence is a series of data points, and those points are interpreted through the lens of historical media tropes, your potential outcomes are often decided before you ever speak to a judge. The rise of synthetic media and deepfakes has added a layer of complexity that the writers of Law and Order could never have imagined. We are seeing a historical trend where the silver bullet strategy of the 2000s, the strategic allegation, is being upgraded with AI. In 2026, the technology to clone a voice or manipulate a video is so accessible that it has become a standard concern in high-conflict divorces. Imagine a scenario where a 30-second audio clip of a father sounding aggressive is presented in mediation. In the past, you would need a witness or a recording. Today, that audio can be manufactured in minutes using a 3-second sample of a man's voice from a YouTube video or a LinkedIn presentation. This is the ultimate evolution of the dark patriarch trope. Television taught us that fathers have a hidden, dangerous side. AI now allows that narrative to be physically manifested as evidence. Let's break down the step-by-step process of how the algorithmic father is marginalized in 2026. Step 1: the collection. Every smart device in the home, the same devices that replace the central television as the heart of the house, is harvesting data on domestic interactions. Step 2: the training. This data is fed into large language models that have been fine-tuned on decades of family law transcripts which, as we have established, are heavily influenced by the bumbling dad and passive father television archetypes. Step 3: the prediction. The software generates a parental risk score. If a man's data doesn't align with the primary caretaker profile, a profile historically and culturally defined as female, his score drops. This technological pipeline is the direct descendant of the social surveillance we discussed in the previous part. We have moved from being watched by our neighbors to being watched by our appliances, and finally to being judged by an invisible code. Television history is essential here because the people who write the code and the judges who use the software grew up in the same media environment we have been deconstructing. When a software developer in 2026 creates a family harmony index, they are subconsciously building it around the modern family or the Brady Bunch models. They are not looking at the nuanced, complex reality of a man's contribution. They are looking for the Phil Dunphy level of compliance. Consider the historical trend of the managed man in the context of AI. In 2026, we see the rise of co-parenting apps that are often mandated by courts. These apps use AI to tone-check messages between ex-spouses. If a father writes a message that the algorithm deems aggressive, even if he is simply being firm about a schedule change, the app flags it. This is the digital version of the man-child trope from 1990s sitcoms like Home Improvement. The man is treated as someone who cannot be trusted to communicate without a digital chaperone. The potential outcome for men who refuse this digital management is a non-compliance report that can be used to restrict their parenting time. Step by step, the 2020s have turned the father's role into a series of user permissions. Step 1. The smart home records the father's absence or presence. Step 2. The co-parenting app filters his communication. Step 3. The predictive algorithm determines his future value to the child. We are living in an era where the show, don't tell rule of television has been applied to a man's entire life. You can tell the court you are a great father, but if the show provided by your data doesn't match the script the algorithm expects, you are fighting an uphill battle against a machine that doesn't sleep. The 2026 legal landscape is a mirror of the 1950s television landscape in one specific ironic way. Both demand a level of scripted perfection that is impossible for a real human being to maintain. In the 50s, you had to be Ward Cleaver. In 2026, you have to be a data-positive asset. But as we look at this algorithmic apocalypse, we must ask, where is the resistance? As television moved from the mass-market sitcom to the niche, fragmented world of YouTube and Rumble, the alternative narrative began to take shape. While mainstream media was perfecting the bumbling dad, a new kind of media was emerging, one that didn't rely on Hollywood writers or network censors. The manosphere, the father's rights creators, and the self-improvement channels began to write a new script for the American man. How did the rise of the indie creator in the 2010s and 2020s create a counterculture that is now clashing with the algorithmic father model? And more importantly, how are men in 2026 using the very same technology that surveils them to finally break the bumbling dad cycle once and for all? We are moving into the era of the sovereign father, where the fight isn't just for custody, but for the right to define who a man is outside of a digital or television script. In the next part, we will explore the counterscript, and how the most hated men on the internet became the most influential voices in the modern divorce survival guide. The algorithm is powerful, but it hasn't won yet. Get ready for the digital insurgency. The digital insurgency did not begin in a courtroom, but in the earbuds of millions of American men. By the time we reached the mid-2010s and accelerated into the current landscape of 2026, the era of the passive television consumer had effectively ended. For decades, men were fed a steady diet of the bumbling dad or the toxic patriarch, but the rise of decentralized media, podcasts, YouTube creators, and independent journalists offered a counterscript that changed the potential outcomes of domestic litigation forever. Imagine if you are Tyler, a 38-year-old father in 2026. Tyler did not grow up watching Ward Cleaver. He grew up watching Jocko Willink and Andrew Huberman. His blueprint for fatherhood is not based on the sitcom trope of the husband who cannot find his own socks, but on the archetype of the high-performance, disciplined leader. When Tyler enters the divorce process in 2026, he is participating in what we now call the counterscript. This is a deliberate step-by-step rejection of the bumbling dad narrative that dominated television from 1980 to 2010. Tyler is aware that the historical trends of family law are weighted by the tropes we have explored, so he uses the very technology that was designed to surveil him to create a digital defense. This is the heart of the digital insurgency. Instead of being the managed man, Tyler becomes the documented man. He understands that in a 2026 courtroom, his character is not what a lawyer says it is, but what his data proves it to be. Historical trends in the 2020s showed a massive surge in men seeking 50-50 joint physical custody. In the 1990s, this was a statistical rarity, often reserved for the most amicable of partings. By 2026, it has become the default legislative push in over 25 states. This shift was fueled by a digital counterculture that provided men with the case studies and legal literacy previously gated behind expensive attorney fees. Tyler, our 2026 case study, spends his evenings not watching sitcoms, but watching live-streamed family law seminars and deep-dive analyses of custody evaluations. He has learned how to speak the language of the best interests of the child standard, without falling into the emotional traps that television dramas often portray as the only way a man can show he cares. Let us look at a step-by-step breakdown of how Tyler and the men of 2026 are hacking the legacy media script. Step 1. The aesthetic overhaul. Tyler knows that if he shows up to a Zoom mediation looking like Al Bundy, disheveled and defeated, he has already lost. He adopts the high-performance aesthetic: fit, organized, and stoic. This is a direct counter to the domestic doofus trope. Step 2. The digital paper trail. Every interaction Tyler has is conducted with the knowledge that it will be read by a third party. He uses the co-parenting apps we discussed in Part 6, but he uses them offensively. He treats every message like a professional memorandum, stripping away the reactivity that sitcom writers love to exploit. Step 3. The independent broadcast. Tyler maintains a social media presence that is a curated gallery of active parenting. He is not posting selfies at a bar. He is posting videos of himself coaching his daughter's soccer team or helping his son with a chemistry project. He is creating a historical record of his involvement that is impossible to reconcile with the bumbling dad image. This digital insurgency has created a massive friction point with the legacy legal system. Judges and evaluators who are still operating on the scripts of the 1990s and 2000s are often baffled by the 2026 father. They expect the managed man who is willing to take the visitor role, but they are met with the sovereign father who demands an equal share of the domestic responsibility. This has led to a rise in what legal scholars are calling the narrative clash. On one side, you have the mother's counsel often relying on the historical trend of the father as the secondary parent. On the other side, you have the father providing a mountain of digital evidence that he is, in fact, the primary or equal stabilizer in the home. The case study of Tyler reveals a fascinating potential outcome in 2026. The emergence of the tactical father. Because Tyler knows that his every move is monitored by the Internet of Things and potentially manufactured by AI deepfakes, he has adopted a level of discipline that would have been unthinkable to a man in the 1970s. He has essentially turned his life into a reality show where he is the producer, director, and lead actor. This is a survival mechanism. He knows that the bumbling dad trope is a legal liability, so he replaces it with the high-competence archetype. This is the digital insurgency in action, using the tools of the surveillance state to prove a man's domestic worth. However, there is a dark side to this counterscript. As men have become more adept at documenting their competence, the tactics used against them have evolved. In the 1980s, the threat was social stigma. In the 2000s, it was the silver bullet allegation. In 2026, the new weapon is the accusation of parental alienation. When a father is too involved, too competent, and too documented, the counter-argument often shifts from he is a bad dad to he is too good of a dad, and is using his competence to undermine the mother. This is the ultimate irony of the American television history we have tracked. We have moved from a world where the man was the undisputed head of the household to a world where being a competent father can be framed as a form of psychological warfare. Consider the historical trends and how the media portrays this new conflict. In 2026, we see a rise in prestige dramas that focus on the parental alienation trap. These shows often depict a father who is so obsessed with winning that he loses the heart of his child. It is the new way the bumbling dad trope has been rebranded for a more sophisticated audience. Instead of being stupid, the man is now portrayed as calculated. The message remains the same. A man's leadership in the home is inherently suspicious. Imagine if Tyler, despite his perfect documentation and his high-performance lifestyle, finds that his children are becoming distant. He has the data to prove he was there, but he does not have the script to deal with a child who has been coached to fear his discipline. This is the new frontier of the 2020s. We are seeing a historical trend where the legal battle has moved out of the bank accounts and into the minds of the children. The digital insurgency gave men the tools to fight the bumbling dad trope, but it also raised the stakes to a level of psychological complexity that no sitcom could ever capture. Step by step, the men of 2026 are realizing that winning the data war is only half the battle. Step 1. Disprove the bumbling dad trope with digital evidence. Step 2. Maintain a high-performance lifestyle to counter the toxic patriarch image. Step 3. Navigate the new legal minefield of alienation and psychological manipulation. We have come a long way from the flickering black and white screens of the 1950s. We have deconstructed the bumbling dad, the absent provider, the toxic anti-hero, and the algorithmic father. But as we look toward the final stages of this masterclass, we have to face the most uncomfortable question of all. What if the system is designed to be unwinnable? What happens when the counterscript itself becomes a target for the next generation of legal and cultural weapons? In the next part, we are going to dive into the era of the weaponized child. We will explore how the 2020s turned the smallest members of the family into the most powerful witnesses in the divorce industrial complex. We will look at the rise of child-centered media and how it has coached an entire generation of children to view their fathers through the lens of a clinical diagnosis. The script is changing again, and this time the words are coming from the mouths of babes. You need to see how the 2026 father is being judged by the very people he is fighting to stay close to. The loop is closing, and the stakes are about to get personal. The most profound shift in the history of American domestic litigation did not happen in the law books. It happened in the psychology of the child. If the 1950s were about the child as an extension of the father's legacy, and the 1990s were about the child as a victim of the broken home, then 2026 is the era of the child as the ultimate moral arbiter. Imagine if you are Marcus, a father navigating a high-conflict custody battle in the current landscape of 2026. You have spent years documenting your involvement, you have disproved the bumbling dad trope with your professional success, and you have avoided the toxic patriarch trap by being emotionally present. But you walk into a custody evaluation, only to find that your 12-year-old son has been taught to view your every attempt at discipline through the lens of a clinical diagnosis. This is the rise of the therapeutic child, a generation coached by television, streaming content, and social media to act as the primary witness against the paternal figure. To understand how we reached this point, we have to look at the historical trends in child-centered television. In the era of Leave It to Beaver, children were portrayed as naive and in need of constant guidance. By the time we reached the 1990s and shows like Rugrats or The Simpsons, the narrative had flipped. The children were often smarter than the adults, but their rebellion was largely harmless. However, the 2010s and 2020s introduced a much more sophisticated and dangerous archetype in shows like 13 Reasons Why, Euphoria, or the myriad of teen-led dramas on streaming platforms. In these narratives, the parents, specifically the fathers, are not just bumbling or absent, they are sources of trauma. The historical trend transitioned from the father as a provider to the father as a pathogen. In 2026, this media saturation has created a case study in narrative implantation. Children today are fluent in the language of therapy before they hit puberty. They are exposed to thousands of hours of content on TikTok and YouTube that teaches them to identify signs of narcissism, gaslighting, and emotional unavailability. While these are legitimate psychological concepts, when filtered through the lens of a 12-year-old who wants to avoid chores or homework, they become powerful weapons in a divorce. Imagine if Marcus tells his son to put away his tablet. In 1985, that was just parenting. In 2026, the son, influenced by the therapeutic narrative on his screen, tells a court-appointed guardian ad litem that his father is crossing his boundaries and exhibiting controlling behaviors that cause him emotional distress. The potential outcomes for men in this scenario are devastating. The family court system has moved toward a trauma-informed model, which sounds progressive on paper. However, in practice, it often means that the child's subjective feelings, shaped by the media they consume, are given more weight than objective evidence of paternal care. Historical trends show that the voice of the child has become the dominant force in determining custody schedules. If a child, coached by the prevailing media tropes of the toxic or irrelevant father, expresses a preference to stay with the mother, the court in 2026 is increasingly likely to rubber stamp that request under the guise of respecting the child's agency. Let us look at a step-by-step breakdown of how the media coaches the child to become a witness in the divorce industrial complex. Step 1. The deconstruction of authority. Modern child-centric media consistently portrays adult males as either villains to be overcome or obstacles to the child's self-actualization. This breaks the natural bond of respect and replaces it with a dynamic of suspicion. Step 2. The linguistic upgrade. Children are provided with a clinical vocabulary to describe their frustrations. This makes their complaints sound like professional assessments to judges and evaluators who are themselves conditioned by the same therapeutic media culture. Step 3. The digital echo chamber. Once a child begins to view their father through this lens, the algorithms of 2026 feed them more content that validates this view, creating a feedback loop that makes reconciliation nearly impossible. This brings us to the case study of Jordan, a fictional but representative 14-year-old in 2026. Jordan's parents are divorcing. His father, a hardworking man who has always been present, is suddenly facing an alienation claim. Why? Because Jordan has been watching a popular series where the father's high expectations are portrayed as a form of psychological abuse. Jordan starts recording his father during arguments, a tactic encouraged by certain online communities, and then edits those clips to fit the narrative of the toxic patriarch. In the 2026 legal system, these snippets of digital truth are often more persuasive than 20 years of a clean record. Jordan isn't just a child. He is a content creator, and his father is the unwilling antagonist in a story designed for maximum legal impact. The 2026 father is also battling the historical trend of the protective mother trope. Television has spent the last 50 years reinforcing the idea that a mother's instinct is infallible, while a father's involvement is optional or suspect. When a child aligns with the mother in a divorce, the media-driven narrative suggests it is because the mother is the safe parent. This creates a psychological hurdle for men that is almost impossible to clear. Even if the father is the more stable parent, the potential outcome is often dictated by the child's alignment with the culturally dominant primary caretaker archetype. Step by step, we have seen the child move from the background of the divorce to the front lines. Step 1. The 1970s made the child a casualty of divorce. Step 2. The 1990s made the child a negotiator between two homes. Step 3. The 2020s have made the child the prosecutor. This shift has profound implications for the future of the American family. When children are taught that their fathers are sources of trauma, rather than sources of strength, the very foundation of the multi-generational family unit is eroded. We are seeing a historical trend where the father's role is being reduced to a purely financial one. Even as he is physically present, he is allowed to be in the child's life, but only as long as he remains in the managed man or passive provider role. The moment he asserts authority or challenges the child's digital narrative, he risks being cancelled within his own family. The 2026 legal system, influenced by decades of television dramas like Law & Order or more modern psychological thrillers, is primed to see the father as a potential risk. The best interests of the child standard has become so subjective that it can be molded to fit whatever trope is currently trending. For the men of 2026, this means that parenting is no longer just about raising a child, it is about managing a legal liability. Every interaction is a potential scene that could be reviewed by a judge who has been conditioned by 40 years of bumbling dads and toxic patriarchs. But as the child becomes the prosecutor, a new and even more terrifying reality is emerging for the American man. We have talked about the psychological and legal battles, but we have not yet touched the most tangible tool of erasure: the total financial liquidation of the male identity. While the child is being used to win the narrative war, the legal system is using the era of digital assets and globalized wealth to ensure that even if a man wins the custody battle, he loses the ability to sustain his own life. How did the 2020s turn the concept of alimony and child support into a permanent state of financial surveillance? And how is the rise of the subscription economy in 2026 being used to garnish a man's future before he even earns it? In the next part, we are going to dive into the financial erasure of the American father. We will look at how the divorce industrial complex has moved from taking your house to taking your future potential, and why the bumbling dad is now the bankrupt dad. The stakes are no longer just about who you see, they are about what you own, and in 2026 the answer might be nothing. The loop is tightening, and the cost of entry into the next decade of fatherhood has never been higher. The era of financial erasure for the American man in 2026 is the culmination of a half-century of media conditioning that transformed the concept of the provider into a permanent, liquidatable resource. To understand the current landscape, we must look at how television in the 1980s and 1990s shifted from portraying the struggle of the working-class family to glamorizing the high-stakes dissolution of the elite. Shows like Dynasty and Dallas introduced the American public to the idea of the divorce settlement as a form of corporate rating. It was no longer about ensuring the children had shoes, it was about the strategic redistribution of wealth as a narrative climax. This historical trend set the stage for the 2026 reality where a man's future potential is treated as a pre-existing asset to be divided, garnished, and managed by the state. Imagine if you are Christopher, a 45-year-old project manager in the current year of 2026. Christopher has spent 20 years building a career, contributing to a 401k, and paying down a mortgage in a suburban neighborhood. When his marriage enters the dissolution phase, Christopher discovers that the legal system is no longer just looking at the bank accounts he currently holds. Instead, the court utilizes AI-driven career projections to determine his imputed income. This is a case study in the evolution of the earning capacity argument. In the 1970s, if a man lost his job, his support obligations were typically adjusted to reflect his reality. In 2026, the algorithm looks at Christopher's resume, the historical trends of his industry, and the current job market to decide what he should be earning, regardless of his actual employment status. He is effectively being indexed on a version of himself that only exists in a database. This transition was fueled by decades of television procedurals that portrayed the wealthy, withholding husband as the standard antagonist. From LA Law in the late 80s to the modern iterations of Law & Order, the narrative has consistently focused on the man as the hider of assets. This created a cultural baseline of suspicion. In 2026, this suspicion has been codified into the digital discovery process. Every transaction Christopher has made in the last 10 years, every Venmo payment, every cryptocurrency trade, and every automated subscription is analyzed by forensic algorithms. Television history has taught the public that men are naturally deceptive regarding finances, and as a result, the potential outcomes for men in 2026 often involve a total loss of financial privacy. The state disbursement units now operate with the efficiency of a high-frequency trading firm, ensuring that child support and alimony are deducted before the money even hits a man's primary account. Consider the historical trend of lifestyle maintenance, as portrayed in the Real Housewives franchise. These shows, which have dominated the cultural conversation since 2006, popularized the idea that a woman's standard of living during the marriage is a right that must be preserved indefinitely after the divorce. This shifted the legal focus from need-based support to lifestyle-based redistribution. For Christopher, this means that if he and his spouse lived a high-consumption lifestyle funded by debt in his high-stress career, he is now legally obligated to maintain that same level of consumption for two households. Step by step, the media has redefined the goal of divorce from a clean break to a permanent financial tether. Step 1 was the 1980s glamorization of the settlement. Step 2 was the 2000s normalization of the lifestyle as right narrative. Step 3 is the 2026 automation of that debt. The rise of the subscription economy has added a new layer of complexity to the financial erasure of men. In 2026, we own very little. Our software, our cars, and even our home security are services we pay for monthly. Television in the 2010s, through shows like Silicon Valley, reflected this shift toward a service-based society. In a divorce, this means that a man's expenses are fixed and transparent. There is no longer a way to scale back or live frugally to rebuild wealth. If the court determines that Christopher's family requires a certain tier of digital access and subscription services, those costs are locked in. The bumbling dad of the 1990s might have lived in a bachelor pad with a folding chair. The 2026 divorced man is often trapped in a cycle of high overhead service fees that prevent him from ever accumulating capital again. He is not just the bankrupt dad. He is the subscription dad, paying for a life he no longer lives in. We must also examine the case study of the digital asset division. In 2026, wealth is often intangible. A man's professional network, his social media following, and his digital reputation are considered part of the marital estate. Television history prepared us for this through the rise of the influencer archetype. Shows that focus on the creator economy have shifted the public's understanding of what constitutes an asset. If Christopher has spent years building a professional brand on LinkedIn or a side hustle on a streaming platform, the court may value that brand and award a percentage of its future earnings to his ex-spouse. This is the ultimate financial loop. The man is required to continue performing his professional identity to pay for the dissolution of his personal identity. The potential outcomes here are a form of indentured servitude to one's own brand, a reality that was hinted at in the darker episodes of Black Mirror, but is now a standard feature of high-asset litigation. Step by step, the financial identity of the American man has been dismantled. Step 1. The removal of the head of household tax status and the shift toward no-fault asset splits. Step 2. The cultural shift toward lifestyle maintenance as a moral imperative, driven by reality television. Step 3. The 2026 implementation of AI career modeling and digital asset garnishment. For the men watching this today, the problem this solves is the illusion of financial security. We are moving into a period where your net worth is not what you have in the bank, but what a court-ordered algorithm says you can produce over the next 30 years. The historical trends of television have successfully rebranded the total liquidation of a man's future as a form of social justice. When the media spends 50 years showing men as financially incompetent or morally bankrupt, the public and the courts become comfortable with the idea of the state acting as the new patriarch, managing the man's earnings for the sake of the collective unit. Christopher's story is not an outlier in 2026. It is the blueprint. He is working more hours than ever, yet his standard of living is lower than it was when he was 25. He is the engine of a financial system that no longer allows him to keep the fuel. But as we move toward the final chapter of this masterclass, we have to look beyond the bank accounts and the custody schedules. We have to look at the psychological toll of this half-century of erasure. What happens to a man when he is culturally mocked, legally marginalized, and financially liquidated? We are entering the era of the final script, where the mental health crisis among divorced men is reaching a breaking point that television refuses to document. How did the 2020s create a silence around the male experience that is more deafening than any 1950s stoicism? And more importantly, as we close this loop in the final part, what is the path forward for the men of 2026 who are ready to stop being the bumbling dad, the toxic patriarch, or the bankrupt provider? We are about to look at the emergence of the reclaimed man and the new American family model that is rising from the ashes of the divorce industrial complex. The history of television is a record of where we've been, but the final part of this series is about where we are going. The most important script is the one you haven't written yet. Get ready for the final deep dive. We are entering the final stage of this masterclass by addressing the most profound and often invisible consequence of 70 years of television history: the psychological silence of the American man. As we stand here in 2026, we are witnessing a historical trend where the stoicism of the 1950s has been replaced not by emotional health, but by a new kind of digital isolation. In the 1950s, a man like Ward Cleaver didn't talk about his feelings because the script didn't allow it. In 2026, a man often doesn't talk about his struggle because he knows the algorithm might categorize his vulnerability as a liability. The potential outcomes for men who internalize the bumbling or toxic archetypes are documented in the rising rates of post-divorce depression and social withdrawal. We have spent 9 parts deconstructing the legal, financial, and cultural weapons used in the divorce industrial complex, but this final part is about the reconstruction of the male identity. Imagine if you are Jackson, a 40-year-old father in the current year of 2026. Jackson has just navigated a 2-year legal battle that felt like a curated highlights reel of every trope we have discussed. He was portrayed as the bumbling provider in the early hearings, the toxic patriarch during the discovery phase, and the redundant father during the custody evaluation. He faced the financial erasure we analyzed in Part 9, leaving him with a fraction of the assets he spent 2 decades accumulating. But Jackson represents a new historical trend. The reclaimed man Jackson realizes that while he cannot control the television script of the past or the legal algorithm of the present, he can control the narrative of his own life moving forward. He is the first generation of men to actively engage in what sociologists are calling the counterscript reconstruction. The first step in Jackson's reconstruction is the total rejection of the bumbling dad trope in his internal dialogue. Television taught Jackson that he was a domestic apprentice who needed to be managed. In 2026, Jackson counters this by achieving a level of domestic mastery that is undeniable. He doesn't just help with the kids. He manages the complex logistics of their lives with the same precision he uses in his professional career. This is a case study in high-competence parenting. When the legal system tries to pigeonhole him into the visitor role, Jackson presents a digital record of his domestic leadership that contradicts 40 years of sitcom history. He has learned that in the era of the quantified father, competence is the only defense against marginalization. Step by step, the reclaimed man of 2026 is rebuilding the community that the 1990s and 2000s dismantled. Step 1. The end of isolation. Jackson joins a local chapter of a fatherhood collective, a growing movement in 2026 where men meet physically to share legal strategies, psychological support, and parenting techniques. This is the death of the isolated bachelor trope. Step 2. The development of legal literacy. Jackson doesn't just hand his life over to an attorney. He becomes a co-strategist in his own defense, understanding the historical trends of his jurisdiction and the specific biases of the predictive software being used. Step 3. The integration of the therapeutic child. As we discussed in Part 8, Jackson's children have been coached by media to view him through a clinical lens. Jackson counters this not with anger or defensiveness, but with a consistent stoic presence. He refuses to play the role of the antagonist in their therapeutic narrative, eventually forcing the children to reconcile their screen-based tropes with the reality of his character. Historical trends in 2026 show that this shift is working. We are seeing a gradual but significant increase in the number of men who maintain primary or equal involvement in their children's lives after a high-conflict dissolution. This is not because the system has changed its fundamental nature, but because the men have changed their approach. They have moved from being passive consumers of a negative narrative to being active producers of a positive reality. The death of the traditional sitcom has actually helped this transition. Without a single, dominant cultural narrative like Father Knows Best or Married with Children, the American man is free to build a bespoke identity that fits his specific values and circumstances. However, we must address the case study of the financial recovery. In Part 9, we looked at the total liquidation of the male identity. For Jackson in 2026, the potential outcome of financial erasure is countered by the rise of the sovereign economy. Men are increasingly diversifying their income streams into decentralized assets and private contracts that are less susceptible to the automated garnishment systems of the state. This is not about evading responsibility. It is about ensuring that a man has the capital necessary to remain an active, providing force in his children's lives. The historical trend is moving toward the subscription-proof man, someone whose value cannot be fully captured or liquidated by an algorithm. As we conclude this deep dive masterclass, we have to look at the new American family model emerging in 2026. It is a model that is no longer defined by the nuclear perfection of the 1950s or the fragmented chaos of the 2000s. Instead, it is the era of parallel parenting and domestic sovereignty. In this model, the father is not a visitor or a managed apprentice. He is an equal, independent pillar of the child's world. The history of television tried to tell us that this was impossible, that a man was either a king or a clown. 2026 is proving that he can simply be a man. Competent, present, and unerasable. Step by step, the 2020s have prepared us for this moment. Step 1. The pandemic forced us to see the reality of the home. Step 2. The digital insurgency gave us the tools to document our truth. Step 3. The financial erasure forced us to redefine what we truly own. The loop of American television history is finally closing. We have moved from the flickering black and white screens that told us what to be, to the high-definition algorithms that tried to tell us who we are. But the screen is just a reflection, and in 2026, men are starting to look past the reflection and back at themselves. The bumbling dad is dead. The toxic patriarch is a relic of a previous generation's writer's room. What remains is the reclaimed man, standing in a courtroom or a kitchen, ready to write the next 10 parts of his own story. But even as we finish this deep dive into the history of the screen, a new question arises. As we move into the late 2020s, the battle for the family is shifting from the legal arena to the biological one. What happens when the next generation of technology doesn't just monitor your life, but attempts to optimize your very personality for the sake of social cohesion? How will the reclaimed man survive the rise of the biometric state? We are just beginning to see the first signs of the next great shift in the American domestic landscape. In our next special deep dive, we are going to explore the rise of the biohacked family and the 2027 legislation that aims to regulate paternal influence through neurological monitoring. You think the algorithm was tough? Wait until you see what happens when the state has access to your brainwaves. The script is getting more complex, and you need to be ready for the next level of the game. We are moving from the history of television to the future of the human species. Don't miss the start of our next series.